Hey, what's going on, guys? Lightning XZ here, and I know I haven't done something like this in a while, or just a deck tech in general in a while, but I figured I'd do something a little bit different while I also bring in a deck tech. So this is a proxy vintage, whatever you want to call it, because a lot of the cards, as you can see, are proxies or some sort of like proxy alter um, paradoxical outcome deck. It's honestly one of my favorite decks of all time to play. Especially, when my friends come over or, well, when they used to come over at least, or we'd all meet up somewhere and we would play some proxy vintage, and this is 9 times out of 10 the deck I would play. So some quick disclaimers. Obviously, you can see the mess right here. Yeah, ignore that mess. That mess does not exist. This is the mess that you want to pay attention to. Um, anyway, so I'll just get started and go ahead and start explaining the deck. So basically your goal right here, which these are the basic win conditions here, is you want to just slam a bunch of artifacts in play. You want to, such as, like the Power 9 that makes mana and whatnot that I have right here. Other artifacts like Mox Opal, Mana Crypt, Mana Vault, Top Soul Ring. Not so much Bolas's Citadel. Bolas's Citadel kind of sort of like an alternate win condition to an extent. But like if you have to outcome it, then whatever. But ultimately your goal is to, there's a couple win conditions. Monastery Mentor is a very powerful win condition. Monastery Mentor is, a very infamous card, has prowess, which gives it +1/+1 whenever you cast a non-creature spell, and then whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you put a monk with prowess onto the battlefield. So that's a win condition right there. Your other win condition, another very infamous combo, you could assemble Voltaic Key and Time Vault. Time Vault enters the battlefield tapped. It does not untap during your untap step. You can skip your turn to untap it, and when you tap it, you take an extra turn after this one. Voltaic Key says untap target artifact, so you basically pay one, tap it to untap this, and then you take an extra turn. You do that an infinite amount of times, and your opponent just gives up because you don't have infinite turns. Another win condition, which is probably my most most used win condition, if you will. It's the way I win, I'd say like 40% of the time. The Storm plan, where you just artifacts paradox, go ahead and do your thing. If you can't assemble Vault Key right away, or Tinker Vault Key, whatever, right away, and you have this and you feel confident in this, you can Tendrils of Agony your opponent, which drains your opponent for 2 and has Storm. Going through the mana base here, have a couple fetch lands, have an Underground Sea Tundra, 2 Underground Seas rather. Wow, didn't catch that. I always thought I had 1 in the deck. I thought that was a bad land for some reason. Volcanic Island, a regular island, and then a really nice looking Tolarian Academy. Tolarian Academy taps for a blue for each artifact you control. Very powerful card in Vintage. It's no wonder why it's restricted. The Power 9, I play all of them. All of the Moxen, the Recall, Time Walk, Time Twister. Time Walk is obviously like a very powerful card, especially for this deck, along with Time Twister. Especially like if you have Time Twister, for example, and then you have the option to like Yawgmoth's Will, like other stuff. I almost always Time Twister first before I Yawgmoth's Will. There's probably be someone in the comments saying that that's wrong of me to do to Time Twister when I have access to Yawgmoth's Will, but I personally love to have my graveyard empty when I can, especially if my opponent is playing like some sort of like control deck, or like God forbid like a Vintage Reanimator deck, which I have seen before. I have built one before, and I have seen some float around online. So Time Twister is very powerful against that kind of deck too. For those of you that don't know what Time Twister does, each player shuffles their hand and graveyard in their library, then draws 7. So I mean, I've seen Vintage Reanimator before, so it's not unheard of. Some other artifacts, which are very, like, essentially, like, your outcome targets that are not, like, these cards right here. Some Mox Opals, Mana Crypt, Mana Vault, a Dining Top, which is pretty good. I'm doing a lot of other things than just, obviously, being a Paradox target, but also combos very well with Bolas's Citadel, which basically says you could, look at the top card of your library at any time. When you can play lands and spells off the top of your library, and then instead of paying mana, if you cast a spell, you pay life. So you could basically, like, this essentially becomes another copy of Necropotence if you have this on the field. And then you could tap it, sack it, or tap it, and then sack 10 permanents, and then or 10 non-land permanents or something like that, and target opponent loses 10. But you're almost always going to want to like combo these and then make this again like a second copy of like Necropotence essentially. And then you just draw like a bunch of cards, and then you can assemble your win condition a lot quicker. Some support cards and like other spells, like card like Flusterstorm to protect yourself if you're going for the Storm plan. Past in Flames and Yawgmoth's Will, again, very good if you're going for the Storm plan, or if you're also just trying to assemble Vault Key. Especially like if your Time Vault or your Key or like any of your other win condition pieces, for example, they end up getting stuck in the graveyard. Yawgmoth's Will is very good at just bringing them back. Past in Flames again, like if you're going for like the Tinker Vault Key plan, or if you're going for the Storm plan, that's also just really good. Hurkyl's Recall, very good at putting artifacts back in your hand and then throwing them back down, which is also really good with some other like support cards that I have up top. Vampiric Tutor and Demonic Tutor, obviously just really powerful cards. Some cantrips like Preordains and Ponders. Jaxian Probe, very good for basically giving you information, letting you know if it's okay to go off with Vault Key or with your Tendrils or whatever. And then Force of Will, obviously. Force of Will is just a very powerful counterspell. Now, some other like cards which also are like very good at like interacting with different plans of attack. Necropotence, very, very, very good when you're going for the Storm plan. Especially when you like activate it at your the end of your opponent's turn. It's very good for the Storm plan if you know you can go off next turn, or it's even better if you end up like Necropotence into Vault Key and then you just Vault Key your opponent. It just makes it 20 times better. Storm Conduit. If you have this in play while you're going for the Storm plan, chances are you're probably going to kill your opponent if you end up breaking. So if your opponent can't like kill this and you're going off with Storm, if you can't find Tendrils, you're probably going to kill them with this anyways, because whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, it deals 1 damage. There's as you can see, a lot of instants and sorceries, so you're probably just going to like knock your opponent dead on their ass with this. Joyra Weatherlight Captain. This card is just very good. Whenever you're casting a historic spell, draw a card. Artifacts, legendaries, and sagas are considered historic. So, like, these two planeswalkers right here, the 3 planeswalkers right here. Wow, Ral, I'm sorry, I didn't forget about you. But yeah, like, these planeswalkers right here, all of this stuff right here, Vault Key even, they're all historic because they're artifacts. So you could just do this and just like draw a bunch of cards. At one point, like it was like turn like I want to say like 5 or 6 or something like that. I ended up drawing like half my deck because of this card. And this card's honestly just like really nuts, and it just combos really well with this with like Paradoxical Outcome and like Hurkyl's Recall, because then you can obviously just bounce all your artifacts and whatnot, and then like draw a bunch of cards off of Outcome, and then send them back into play, and then draw them again. It's a really insane card, and like I said, you can end up drawing like half your deck on like turn 4 or turn 5 if your opponent can't stop this. Ashok Dream Render, really good at like controlling your opponent. You can also mill your opponent and then eat their graveyard, or you can mill yourself and then still eat their graveyard, which I think is a really neat interaction with like Yawgmoth's Will. Especially if you know you're going to end up, like, you know, wanting to cast Yawgmoth's Will, but, like, you're probably only, like, 9 times out of 10 going to mill your opponent. But there have been times where I have right before casting Yawgmoth's Will, I would mill myself and then cast Yawgmoth's Will because I don't have, like, a way to draw cards. So I'm, like, milling myself to try to find a way to draw cards. So that's also a thing. And then Narset, again, just another way to control your opponent, keep them from drawing, you know. Also a very good card against like Grixis Thieves even, which loves to draw cards. And then you could just, you know, top 4, grab something big, like grab one of these bad boys, grab some of these bad boys, you know, stuff like that. Some of these bad boys even. Well, except you, I'm sorry, but you're a creature. But, you know, you almost never, like, brick off of Narset. Like, I think I might have bricked off of Narset once, and it was because it was literally, like, 4 fucking lands straight. But that almost, like, never happens because, again, your mana base is, like, so small. Which I prefer a very small mana base for a deck like this, as opposed to having, like... Because I've seen, like, some versions of this deck, they play, like, at least, like, 17 lands. I can't, like, wrap my head around playing so many lands, and you're, like, wasting slots that you could be using on like artifacts and like other win conditions. It just baffles me seeing decks like that exist in that form when I don't know. I don't claim to be a vintage expert, but that's just personally how I feel about that. Anyways, the sideboard, very exciting part of the deck, except not really. There are some new cards, new-ish cards, um, in here. A lot of the cards that are in here are, essentially to attack. They're not so much to attack, like, competitive vintage, but it's more or less to attack, like, my local meta. But it's also meant to like attack, but just based on like kind of sort of what I've seen online, because just playing online on like Untap or Cockatrice, there's like a lot of these decks that I basically sideboard's built for. I've seen them constantly, but like an island that's mostly for like control decks that like to play like Wasteland, Strip Mine, stuff like that. Um, I did play against like a Leovold deck that played like 4 Wastelands and a Strip Mine, and it just dominated me. I could not beat that deck to save a life because I just kept losing like all my lands. And even if, I had like all this in play, Deathray Shaman basically was just owning me like crazy. So this helps me a little bit, but not too much. This helps in a lot of situations. It's extra protection, also good again in the mirror if I'm like playing like a mirror match, like someone playing a very identical, if not the same list against me. Also good, pretty good against control decks. Another card against like control decks and whatnot. Echoing Truth. Nothing feels better than your opponent having 4 Deathrite Shamans in play when they're playing Vintage, and you Echoing Truth or Deathrite Shaman, and nothing feels greater than that. Thieving Skydiver. Now, I know what a lot of people are going to be saying, X can't be 0 on the kicker cost, so what's the point of you playing it? Well, Thieving Skydiver isn't necessarily, like, supposed to, like, target, like, the Moxen or anything like that. I more or less have this in the sideboard against, again, like, the Mirror, for example, and wow, that glare is awful. But anyways, I have this for, again, like, the Mirror, for example, or another example where I would want to like bring this card in, um, like a Doomsday deck even, or like just a normal Tinker deck. It's not even a Paradoxical Outcome deck, or like Infernal Oath even. I might even want to bring this in, purely just to like slow them down. Like honestly, there's a lot of decks I can think of that basically I would bring Thieving Skydiver in just to like take their Soul Ring or take their like Divining Top or something like that. Take their Mana Vault, take their very like an artifact that they find useless at the time, but then I have it and it just accelerates me. Like if I was to steal someone's like Mana Vault, for example, or steal someone's like Divining Top or their Soul Ring, they're gonna be like, yeah, okay, whatever, if we end up fighting for it and I end up winning the fight, playing a bunch of counter magic and whatnot, they're not gonna think much of it, and then all of a sudden I'm gonna be like a turn ahead of them or something like that. So that's my whole reasoning behind having Skydiver in the sideboard. Another copy of Hurkyl's Recall, again, very good against like the Mirror. It's also just really good at accelerating me, making my turns a bit quicker, especially if cards like Wheel of Fortune, for example, which is in the deck. If Wheel of Fortune just ends up being really bad, because say I'm playing against like Grixis Thieves or something like that, maybe I'm going to want to take out Wheel of Fortune, bring in Hurkyl's Recall. Force of Negation, just extra protection, and yes, this is a real Force of Negation. Yeah, just like some extra protection. Keep myself alive on my opponent's turn rather than my own turn. Probably could end up casting it on my turn a few times here and there, though. Obviously, I don't need to use the force effect. I could literally just hard cast it. Mind's Desire, another alternate win condition that I can bring in. If essentially like, the Tendrils of Agony plan isn't working, but I feel confident enough in the Vault Key plan, I can bring this in. Obviously the deck is really good at like making a bunch of mana very quickly, so Mind's Desire is just really good. One copy of Pyroblast, again, just some more extra protection. Very good against other control decks. Pretty good against, like, Doomsday and whatnot. Other decks that, like, basically any deck that plays blue, I'm almost always putting this in. Combo Council of Allocation. Very good card. I honestly want to say a very, very underrated card, especially in Vintage. Because a lot of Vintage is non-creature spells. So if my opponent is, like, again, playing in, like, if I'm playing a mirror match, if I'm playing, like, a control deck or something like that, this is actually a recent addition to my sideboard, in fact, along with the Skydiver, but this is, like, fairly recent, like, a couple weeks ago, I actually just put this in my sideboard, but yeah, like, other control decks, the mirror, again, just a lot of decks in Vintage in general, I'm probably bringing this in if they're a much faster, like, if they're a deck that's faster than me, or like on the same speed as me, like if they're a Tinker deck that tries to assemble Vault Key just like I'm trying to do, I'm probably going to be putting this in to basically be like, hey, try not to Vault Key because I'm going to make you fight for your Vault Key kind of thing. Or if they're just a pure, like, all-out Paradoxical Storm deck, which is what this deck actually used to be, then chances are I'm probably bringing this in as well. Two copies of Tormod's Crypt. Wow, that is a mouthful. Tormod's Crypt basically in there for, like, graveyard strategies like Dredge, Vintage Reanimator, which again I've seen multiple times, more than I care to admit. Null Rod, very good against, like, again, like, mirror-ish, like, matches. Matches where my opponent is probably quicker. Doomsday is also a really good example because Doomsday is fairly as quick, if not quicker than me, from the matchups that I've played. I always would end up 2-1-ing or getting 1-2'd playing against Doomsday decks, so this is a good example of a card that I'll probably bring in against a deck like that, or again, like, decks that are quicker than me. Another really good deck against, like, control-like decks, like Xerox and Leovold decks and, like, other decks like that, and, like, Infernal Oath decks, which cannot really, like, punish this deck very well, or just Oath of Druid decks in general. 2 copies of Defense Grid. Defense Grid really hurts me as well, but it also acts as another Paradox target, which is a really interesting interaction that I like. So, like, let's say it's my opponent's turn, and then he says go, and then for some reason I am feeling, like, out of my mind, and I decided to Paradox target my defense grid or something like that, and then just chew him out in the next turn. I don't know. It's something I've done once, and I end up winning the game. Don't recommend doing it on a consistent basis, but I don't know. Defense grid is just really good at protecting yourself, especially against, like, strong, like, heavier, like, Vintage control decks and decks that like to protect themselves just as much as you like to protect yourself. And then Blightsteel Colossus, it's essentially another Tinker target. If the Vault Key and the Tendrils plan isn't working, whichever one you feel like works less, take it out, put in this, or you can also take it all out and then just leave in this and just go all out on the Blightsteel Colossus. I almost always, if I end up, like, boarding this in, like, if I'm this is like a very, like, specific, like, board in for, like, again, the mirror or Grixis Thieves even, which tends to be a little bit quicker than me sometimes, depending on the variation. Because I've seen some Grixis Thieves decks that are just, like, all out on, like, the Thieves plan, where it just tries to kill me with the Notion Thief Wheel of Fortune plan, where my opponent just draws a bunch of cards and then I draw absolutely nothing, and then they just kill me like that. But then I've also seen, like, variations where it's like it's a Grixis Thieves deck, but it's also a Vault Key deck, and it's just it's weird. But basically, anything Vault Key related, I'm probably going to be bringing this in just to try to give myself a turn 1, turn 2 kill. And since, like, exile effects like Path to Exile and Swords of Plowshares isn't super common amongst decks like that, like, especially like a Leovold deck, I've seen most Leovold decks, they'll play, like, Sultai and, like, Splash Red, so I never really had to be too worried. But basically, this is more specifically against, like, mirror matches that like to Vault Key. but if it's like a Leovold deck or something like that, like a control deck that was trying to also Volt Key, then this is probably coming in just to make myself a bit quicker, although they're probably going to do the same thing, which doesn't really matter too much, because if you slam your Blightsteel into play, and then your opponent just slams their Blightsteel into play, well, now you both have now you both have an 11/11 with Trample Infect. It's basically like playing Standstill, um, which is actually probably another reason why I'll probably bring in like Blightsteel Colossus, or a card like Pyroblast or like Mind's Desire. Because like if I bring in Mind's Desire, my opponent's playing like Standstill, unless they have a Flusterstorm to like do something about it, then that Mind's Desire is probably resolving, and I really couldn't care less if they draw 3 cards. But yeah, anyways, that is a very long deck tech, but that is my Paradoxical Storm, Paradoxical vintage, proxy vintage deck. Let me know what you all think of this deck. Let me know what changes you think I should make. Let me know what additions and subtractions to the sideboard especially. I'm trying to update the sideboard, with the exception of a few cards. The sideboard hasn't been updated in like a while, I think, like with the exception of like Skydiver and Kumball or whatever the fuck his name is. But yeah, with the exception of those and like Force of Negation, I haven't updated this sideboard since the release of, I want to say, like Ravels of Ixalan or something like that. Now the main deck has been updated constantly. Bolas' Citadel, for example. I ended up actually like trimming. I want to say originally I trimmed the Tundra for Bolas' Citadel. But then I ended up keeping the Tundra, and then I want to say I trimmed, because I used to play 2 copies of Divining Top. I think, no, that doesn't sound right. I don't know, I was playing 2 copies of, I was playing some other like card that really just irked me every time I drew it. It was a second copy of something. I think it was a second key. It was a second key. I was playing two copies of key, and it just irked me every time I drew the second key. So I just trimmed that and then put this in. And then my winning conditions are like have been pretty like much the same. These cards have like stayed fairly the same throughout the most part. I mean, these 3 cards, obviously. Those cards actually were originally, fun fact, these were originally, one of them was a Mox Opal, and then 2 of them were lands, and I started trimming lands, because I know I tend to be flooded very easily, and then when I started putting these in, all of a sudden, like, being flooded was never really an issue, which is why I don't like playing a lot of lands in my vintage decks. So I like playing, like, vintage decks that don't play a lot of lands, purely because I tend, with my luck, to just get flooded. But again, let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Let me know if I should do deck techs like this more often, or if I should just stick to doing them online. Anyways, I'm Lightning XZ. You've been amazing, and I will see you all on Wednesday for the Lightning XZ and Friends podcast. And if you miss it, or you're watching this at a later date, then I will see you whenever I see you. Peace.